All the parts for my C64 build have now finally arrived, so join me for part 2 of this episode, where I'll show you how you can build a new Commodore 64 in 2020. In part 1 of this episode, we looked at some of the ways in which you can still use a Commodore 64 today, including a look at emulation, buying a second-hand machine, and some of the options that are now available to you if you want to build a new, or at least a nearly new, Commodore 64. In today's episode, I'm going to show you which of the options I've chosen for building a new Commodore 64, and I'll take you through the process of unboxing the parts and putting it all together. Okay, so let's start with the keyboard. This is the one part of this build that I couldn't get a new part for. There are people out there who are making new keyboards, but they tend to be very bespoke and with it very expensive. And they're also using modern key switches, which would take away some of the feel from the original Commodore 64, which I'm keen to keep with this build. I want it to be, to at least look and feel like an original Commodore 64. You also have the problem with new keyboards that you still need to obtain keycaps. And at the moment, there's nobody supplying new keycaps. There are a couple of Kickstarter campaigns that have been out there that have promised to deliver those, but as yet they haven't done. Although the latest one, to be fair, I think that's more down to the latest COVID crisis, and I think once that's out of the way a bit, they will deliver on those. Anyway, this one I sourced from eBay. It's a good example. It's nice and clean. I have taken all the key caps off and stripped them down and cleaned them, and cleaned all the base, and it's looking quite nice now. There's not too much yellowing there. I don't think there's any need for any retro brightening of any kind. So I'm pleased with this keyboard, and it'll be good to go in the build. It's also, appropriately enough, a keyboard from a late C64C machine, which is good because it will match the case that I'm going to be using for my machine as well. Okay, so next up, let's take a look at the motherboard I've gone for. And in the end, I chose the Ultimate 64 board for my machine. This is an FPGA, or Field Programmable Gate Array based replacement motherboard, and it's designed and supplied by a company called Gidion's Logic Architecture, and they're based out of the Netherlands. In the box you get a standard 12-volt power supply and the replacement motherboard itself. And then I've also got went for a badge for the case here, which I may or may not end up using on the final build. So the motherboard itself, it's a complete motherboard. Unlike the Reloaded Mark II board or the 60 clone board, it doesn't require any donor components from an old system. Although it does have the option to use original SID chips instead of using the inbuilt SID implementation. I've gone for the Elite version of the board, which was a little bit more expensive, but it offered a few extra features, such as using zero insertion force sockets for where you can plug in your SID chips. So, starting on the left hand side of the board, we have the backup battery for the real-time clock. I guess is also needed to keep the configuration settings as well. Interestingly, the original Commodore 64 also had a real-time clock, but of course didn't have a battery to keep the time set between power cycles. Next to that we have an internal USB port, which I guess you can use that with a memory stick, and I certainly will for my build. I'll be putting a memory stick in there with some ROM images and disk images on there. Then we have a Wi-Fi chip here, so this isn't as yet implemented in the firmware for the Ultimate 64 board, but hopefully Gidion will add support for that at some point in the near future. And then we come to the heart of this board, which is the Altera Cyclone 5 chip. This is an FPGA chip, which it doesn't emulate a C64. It actually simulates or implements the logic of an original C64 motherboard, along with all the circuitry and the chips, including the processor, the VIC-2 chip and the SID chips. And it's the fact that you have this implementation at the hardware level, along with the fact that you have all the original ports, that makes this board so special for me. I mean, it really is like using a modern revision of the C64 motherboard. Next we have the ZIF sockets, which allow you to plug in a couple of SID chips. And these can be either types of the original SID chip, or you can use either of the types together, or you can even use some of the new implementations of a SID chip, such as the ARM SID. Alternatively, you can leave these empty and use the onboard SID implementation, which, although not 100% accurate, I think it's pretty good. Here we have a header for a user port adapter. As you'll see when we move around the back, the space where the user port is usually on a C64 is now occupied by an HDMI, USB and Ethernet ports. However, if you do need to use that user port, then Gidion does have an adapter available that you can plug in here. Moving around to the right hand side, we have the power in socket that takes a 12 volt power supply, a multifunction power button, and a couple of DB9 joystick ports. We also have the keyboard connector and the LED connector that supports a bi-color LED that shows power on and disk activity. Moving around the back, we have the expansion port where you can plug in any C64 compatible cartridges. Then we have the serial port where you can plug in a standard C64 disk drive, and the AV out where you can plug in your composite out. And then we come to the space where you would normally expect to find the user port on a Commodore 64, but this is now taken up with some new ports. So we have a couple of external USB ports, an Ethernet port, and an HDMI output port. And then last but by no means least, we have the cassette port where you can plug in a standard dataset and load your C64 tapes. The final part we have of this build is the case. Now this is a brand new case, and it's been produced by a German-based company called Pixel Wizard, and they're producing brand new C64C style cases using the original molds that would have been used by Commodore. In a nice touch, they also supply the case in a box that strongly resembles the style of box used by Commodore for their Amiga line of computers. So let's try to carefully open this box without damaging it. Just needs to ease this open carefully. It's quite a tight fit, so let's just carefully prise that open. There we go. So inside here we have the C64 case. There's some space at the front here as well that you can, once we put the finished machine, we can keep that back in, and we've got some space here where we can put the power supply and the HDMI cable and the other bits and pieces. So let's just carefully lift the case out and put the box to one side. In addition to the original grey colour, the cases are also available in a variety of other colours, and I've chosen one based on the colour scheme of the C64 SX system. That was the portable version of the Commodore 64, and that consists of a case which has a grey base and a dark brown lid. So on top here we have the serial number sticker that goes on the back of the case, and this one matches the Ultimate 64 Elite, and a nice touch there, it's got made in the Netherlands, which of course is where Gidion, who makes the motherboard, is based. So now let's just carefully take the lid off and see what other goodies we got inside. Just unclip it at the sides here, and then carefully lift off at the back there. Just make sure we don't snap off any of those retaining clips. So first of all, inside here we've got some small screws, some main ball screws, and then what else have we got? Let's carefully take this out. Right, okay, so we've got the bi-color LED here. That's a red and green LED. So you have one color for your power, one color for drive activity, and I think that's you can change that through the firmware. Next up, we've got some more screws. So I've got plenty of screws in case I lose any. And then finally we've got a pack of 3D printed parts here, so that includes some parts to mount the keyboard on. So with the C64C you need these mounting plates for the keyboard, and then I've also got some bits that go around the side here to fill in the gaps around the power inlet and the power switch, because on the Elite, the Ultimate Elite, they're smaller than they would be on an original C64 motherboard. Okay, so we're now ready to mount our motherboard, and before we do that I'm going to need to put in the 3D keyboard mounting plates, so I'm going to do that now and then mount the motherboard. So that's all done. I have a memory stick here that I'm going to put into the internal USB socket. That's got some ROMs on it and some disk images and tape images, and then we're going to put the keyboard on. So for the plug on that, one of the holes has got a blank in it, so that you know which way around to put that on the connector. So I'm just going to ease that carefully on to the connector on the motherboard, and then we're going to sit that in the case. So that needs to just go in at the front here under these retaining lugs. So ease that under there, and then rest it down on the mounting, the 3D printed mounts, and they need to be screwed down with a couple of screws. So let's just carefully put the screw here on the left first. And then we'll put the screw in here on the right, and they just need to be done up sort of hand tight. Make sure you don't over tighten them. Okay, so that's the keyboard in, the motherboard in. Now we just need to put the lid on. I've put in the LED, I've fitted that into the top, to the lid of the case, and we just need to plug that into the LED connector here. It's a 3-pin connector. So just carefully put that in, and then I've just twisted the cable around before doing that, and just fit that in under the keyboard, and then carefully lower the lid down. Make sure we don't squeeze in any cables there. Just carefully lower the lid down, and then through the magic video I've tightened that all up, and it's all nicely put together. So here is the fully assembled C64. You can see there's the 3D bit that goes around the power inlet and the power button, and then around the back here you can see where on originally there would have been the user port. We've got our USB ports, Ethernet port, and HDMI. And there we are, all fully and put together, ready for powering up. Okay, so I've connected my machine up to a television with the HDMI cable. Let's plug in the power and press the power switch. Okay, so the power lights come on, gone green. So let's hope that in a second we get something on the screen. And there we go, we've got the initial screen for the Ultimate 64 that basically tells us, as it's supplied, it doesn't come with any system ROMs. We need to find these ourselves. But they're easily found on the internet. You can find them if you've got the Vice emulator, they're in there. And I've got mine from my copy of C64 Forever. If I go into the menu by briefly pressing the power switch, there we go. And then I need to go into the memory stick that I've put into the internal USB port. I go into my ROMs. Select the first one, basic ROM. We need to go down and flash as an original basic ROM. Okay, then I go to the character ROM, press enter, and flash that as the original character ROM. And then finally we go down to kernel, press enter, and we want to flash this as the original kernel ROM. And you see they also have space for alternate ROMs, so if you've got Jiffy DOS or Dolphin DOS, you can load those up as alternate ROMs as well. Okay, so next we need to reboot the machine, so reboot C64 from the menu there, and then hopefully that should power up. There we are, so it's powered up with the familiar blue screen, and our system ROMs are all loaded. Okay, so let's go back into the menus again, have a look, see what we've got here. So we've got the Ulti-SID, that's the inbuilt SID emulation, and go look there, some of the options we've got for that. Let's go through again. Let's have a look at some of the Ultimate 64 settings. So we've got NTS and PAL settings that we can set there. We've got HDMI scan lines that we can set. Then we've got some options here for the LEDs. So this is where we can set which color corresponds to which activity. And then we also, with the latest version of the firmware for the Ultimate 64, you can set the CPU speed. So from standard 1 MHz all the way through to 48 MHz. What else we got? So let's save that. Let's have a look in again. This time let's have a look at the C64 settings. So we've got some cartridge emulation we can do here. So we've got things like the Action Replay cartridge or the Final Cartridge 3 that we can emulate. That's all built into the Ultimate 64. Go down again. That's where we can select our alternate kernels or basic or character ROMs that we want to run. We've got RAM expansion unit. I'm not too sure what that does. Let's have a look. What else? Save that. Go in again to the menu. We've got so that's the real-time clock that we can set there. We've got some modem settings, so presumably that's associated with the Ethernet port. Again, I don't know what any of these settings do. I'm going to need to, once I've got this machine all finished, I need to go through these carefully and see what they are. I've got tape settings. So there are different tape speeds, whether you're on PAL or NTSC. Finally, we've got the settings for the 1541, so that's the disk drive, so we can go in there and change some of the settings for the 1541 emulation that we have with the Ultimate 64 board. Okay, we've also got the ability with the latest firmware to stream video and audio, so if we connect up a PC through Ethernet with the appropriate software on there, we can stream some output from our C64. Okay, so let's reboot the C64, and because we selected Action Replay emulation for the cartridge. We got that out of the box. Perhaps type in a quick program, make sure the keyboard's all working okay. So let's do a classic Hello World. Print Hello World, and then 20, go to 10. And let's run that. Wow, that brings back some memories. Wow, that's great. Okay, so next I think we'll take a look at loading up a game. So on the internal memory stick that I've got in here, I've got some disk images. So let's just go and see there what we've got. So I think we'll go for 1942, that's a good game. I'm going to mount the disk as opposed to running the disk so it doesn't bypass the fast load of the action replay cartridge that we're emulating. So I'll just type in the standard load command here. And this is a good chance to see the dual action of the LED. So we've got green for the power and then orange for disk activity. I think that's because I haven't set the LEDs up quite right. It should be green and red, and I think to do that I need to set it up so that the green light goes off when there's disk activity. So at the moment it's running the green and the red together. Okay, so let's just run that. Okay, so we've got some options here to just go through. I think I'll just say no to all of these. I think we'll start at stage 1. I think we'll start at stage 24. And we'll reset the high score list. Okay. So there's a very quick example of the Ulti-SID, or the inbuilt FPGA implementation of the SID chip on the Ultimate 64. Unfortunately I haven't got an actual SID chip that I can plug in there to compare it against, although that is something that I would like to add to the build at some point in the future. Okay, so let's have a quick play of the game. I have to say I'm using a fairly old and pretty rubbish joystick for this, and if you can hear the squeaking, that's the fire button, and as you can see I'm not being very good at this, which I'm going to put down to the fact that this joystick is so rubbish. Okay, so perhaps we'll leave that and move on. The last thing I want to go through is updating the firmware on the board. Now I actually happen to know that the firmware on this board is up to date, but nonetheless I'm going to run through it and show you what you need to do that. So first thing we need to do is head on over to the website for the Ultimate 64, and then we go to the firmware section. Now you can see here there have been a lot of updates to the firmware. Gidion is a one-man band, but nonetheless he still manages to get plenty of updates to the firmware on there, and is still very active in that regard. So let's download the latest version here. That will download a zip file, and I need to go over and extract the firmware file onto an external USB drive. So I'm just going to copy that across. There we go, copy that across to my USB drive. I'm then going to go over back to the C64, and I'm going to plug that USB stick into one of the USB ports on the back. Then we go into the menu. There you can see my new USB stick. Go into there. There's the firmware update file. Need to select that and do run update, and then that will then check that the firmware file is okay, and you just say yes, I want to continue flashing it, and that just takes a few minutes to run through it and complete it. So we'll skip past that, and at the end of it just says, do you want to reset the configuration? Actually I don't for this one, and then it will then power the machine down, and then we just switch it back on again, and then go into the menu by pressing the power button briefly, and we can check there at the top there. That will then just tell you the firmware version that you're running. You could just check that it's been done successfully. So there we go. My new 2020 Commodore 64 is now finished and ready to provide many years of 8-bit fun without the worry of things like leaky capacitors or bad memory chips. Now I must admit this wasn't the cheapest solution, and if all you really want to do is play the odd 8-bit game, then emulation may be a better bet. Or you could go for something like the C64. And whilst I know opinion on that system is divided in the 8-bit community, it does provide a physical solution on a reasonable budget. However, as a retro computer enthusiast, what I was really looking for with this project was a modern hardware-based version of the Commodore 64. And I think my machine delivers on that. Not only is it a hardware implementation of the C64, but it also provides access to all the original ports, along with some modern ones like USB, Ethernet and HDMI. And this means that I'll be able to use C64 cartridges with it, along with peripherals like disk drives and tape drives. So now, after a wait of 30 plus years, I finally have my very own Commodore 64. Well, that's it for part 2 and this episode. If you enjoyed it, then why not let me know by liking it with a big thumbs up? Why not get involved in the conversation by leaving me some comments in the comments section below, especially if you're like me, a big fan of retro computers, and would you like to see more episodes like this? Tell me, how do you keep your retro computing memories alive? Is it through the use of emulators, or do you still use some original equipment? Or are you like me, using a modern equivalent like the Ultimate 64 or the Reloaded Mark II? Or perhaps you're using a different system like the Spectrum Next or the Mr. FPGA system. Whatever it is, I'd love to hear about it, so please tell me about it in the comments section below. If you're new to the channel and you want to support it, then please do so by hitting that subscribe button, and don't forget to click on the bell icon to be notified of when I upload new content. But that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and wherever you are, stay safe, keep well, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Microbytes.